Hi, and welcome to Well-MeasuRED, an interview series from Education Perfect, where we bring together leading thinkers in education and learning science to ask a deceptively simple question. What's actually working in EdTech, and how do we know? I'm Jill McGuire, Group Head of Learning Innovation at Education Perfect. And with me here today is my co-host, James Santure, who is a former teacher and leads impact research here at EP. Hi, James.
Hello, Jill. In previous episodes, we've heard from experts pushing us forward on evidence-based instruction and AI in education. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We're talking to someone who's been building a company on those principles for nearly 2 decades and asking him how that has looked in practice.
So our guest today is none other than Shane Smith, co-founder of Education Perfect. Hi, Shane.
Hi there, Jill and James. It's a real pleasure to be here, and congratulations on this really successful podcast series. There have been some really interesting ideas flowing through, and looking forward to today's chat.
Well, we have been looking forward to this series for quite a while because for those of you who don't know, Shane co-founded EP with his brother Craig in 2007. And he did this remarkably while studying medicine at the University of Auckland. And from the very beginning, Shane and Craig built EP around principles of cognitive science. And that was way, way, way back before learning science became the movement that it is today. And after stepping away for a number of years, I think it has been quite a few, Shane is now back to lead EP's AI initiatives, including the development of our AI-powered feedback tool, which is being used by literally hundreds of thousands of students every year. Shane, welcome again to Well-MeasuRED.
Thank you so much, Jill.
Okay, well, Shane, you started building Education Perfect almost 20 years ago, if you can believe that, and as a medical student, as you've told us. So clearly you didn't come from teaching. I'm just wondering what made you want to change the game and innovate in education?
It's really interesting, Jill. I guess I had 2 entry points into EP. The first one was absolutely personal interest, and then the second one was very focused on impact. So when I was going through university, Craig had made the very first version of what was Language Perfect back then, and I was just fascinated by how our brains worked, how we learned, what good learning looked like. And so I got pulled into some of those really meaty, interesting challenges then as a personal interest piece. But then I actually finished my studies and graduated and worked for a year as a junior doctor. And at the end of that, Craig called me and said, Shane, we're going to go from teaching languages and teaching vocab in particular through to teaching English and science and history and humanities. And at that stage, I guess I had a choice. I knew that this was something that I was passionate about and found really interesting. But I also knew that as a doctor, I could have quite a significant impact on each individual patient's life. And so I sort of did a bit of a weighted comparison and said, I can either have a large impact on a very small number of people's lives as a doctor, or I can have a much smaller impact potentially, but on a much larger scale. And, I've been really stoked that we've been able to scale EP now to many millions of students who've been able to benefit from the work we put in. And I think that trade-off worked out pretty well all in all.
That actually segues nicely into my question. So one of the things I find really interesting about that early period is that you weren't just reading the research and applying it in a vacuum. You were also obsessively, and I hope that word obsessively is okay.
It is
close.
Accurate.
Good. Really close to what teachers and students were actually experiencing with the product. How did you balance what the science said should work with what you were seeing and hearing from classrooms as you were going out there and seeing the product in action?
Yeah, so I guess we had a few inputs to this. The very first version of Language Perfect was obviously built by a learner for a learner. And so, that meant that we did a lot of testing on ourselves. Craig was using it to actively learn. But then beyond that, when he graduated and went out to university himself, I know that he spent many, many hours in his student dorms, pulling people aside and saying, hey, you're learning French or German or whatever language it was that the student was learning at the time. Can you sit with me for half an hour? I'd love to see you to use this and see how you interact with it. And he, at that stage, had an internal rule where he would sit silently, no matter what the person did, and just observe. And if they got stuck, then he would observe that and then go away and try to improve things. But we were also fortunate enough that right from the get-go, we were able to get involved with some really supportive schools. At the time, I'm pretty sure Rangitoto College was one of those very supportive schools. And we had a great relationship with our own schools in Kennigan College. And with that, we were able to spend time in classrooms. We were able to talk to teachers. We were able to talk to students and really overlay that over this almost theoretical basis for things, and mesh these ideas and these concepts together, because it's all very well to implement an idea that in a study has proven in a certain context. But what you really need to ensure is that your implementation of that idea in your context actually moves the dial and actually delivers what the research suggests that it should. And that very close contact with students and teachers, I guess, was our initial layer of validation there. Obviously, since then, we've gone out and got a lot more formal validation, which backs up that claim that this really does move the dial as well, which I'm sure we'll be talking about today.
Yes, well, we will, because fast forward 20 years and from those humble beginnings of Language is Perfect in New Zealand, we're now covering all subjects across the curriculum, across New Zealand, Australia, Canada, internationally, in a lot of schools across the world. So that has really expanded. And at the same time, the science of learning has become a much bigger conversation as well, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. It's now shaping public policy. It's in the mainstream. Everyone's talking about it. So it must be nice watching the world catch up to where you were 2 decades ago. But what I was thinking about is, how has the evidence around cognition, around the learning science, changed anything in your mind about what EP should be doing right now?
It's a great question, and I think watching learning science become far more front and center has been a really healthy, and I'd say really necessary evolution in the space. Certainly, when we started building Language Perfect, it was a bit of a wild west, and I think EdTech itself has gone through a few phases during this time. I think initially there was this initial phase of excitement to say, hey, we have these devices in classrooms. We want things that engage our students. We want things that are exciting. And off the back of that, there were a series of tools that were, engaging and exciting, not necessarily so heavily learning based. There was also, during COVID, there was this massive boost and rollout of these tools. And since then, we have seen some degree of disillusionment from teachers saying, a series of these tools, which we really thought were going to move the dial for us, we have implemented, we've done our best, and haven't had the impact that we thought. I think our journey in parallel to this at EP has been to ensure that as we've gone through this process, we've continued going back to the evidence, but then also we have gone out and more strengthened the evidence base and I guess the proof point around the product to ensure that when we do get to this point of disillusionment, we can say, okay, well, it is true that some tools out there don't seem to move the dial. But you can see here that actually EP really cares about this. We have from the ground up. It's been part of our DNA. So why don't you give this a go? And I think, if anything, it's more imperative than ever that we learn from the strong evidence base. And I've been really stoked with the development of our impact team at EP, which you, James, and Jill are heavily involved with, to see that, on an ongoing basis, every new thing we build, as well as our historical things, do have that really strong underpinning. And I think that's just becoming table stakes as we go forward now, and which is fantastic for schools.
So let's now get into what it actually looks like to translate learning science into a product that works at scale, because that's where it can get really hard. There's a real gap between knowing what the research says and building something that delivers on it in a real classroom with real constraints on a daily basis. Where have you found the transition from theory to product the hardest, and what have you learned about getting it right?
I think that one of the challenges in the classroom is that there is sometimes a disjunct between the things that feel good to the learner and the things that really move the dial. And so, we have a constant point of tension to ensure that our learners not only feel good about their learning, but are genuinely challenged and pushed to the point that we're actually improving recall and building their skills and their thinking capabilities. Probably the classic example here is that it's so easy to go on YouTube and to watch a video and then, a day or two later have completely forgotten all of the details. I know that there are a number of other EdTech firms out there that have lent very heavily on passive video consumption. Feels great for the students. It's something that we have veered away from to be a lot more focused on actually really challenging our students on an ongoing basis, because we know that the evidence really does support that approach. That obviously in a classroom raises challenges, because you need to be able to remind teachers of what the evidence says. In a head-to-head, comparison, if it's purely the learner giving feedback, particularly if it's over a short time period where they haven't yet seen the results of the effort that they've put in, sometimes the edutainment version can feel better and get rated better. But we also do know that teachers also have a fantastic education themselves in this evidence, which I think is growing as well. Probably another example is differentiation, and I think this is another tug of war that we have worked through over the years. An ideal learning system would be 100% adaptive to each student. But the reality is that these students sit in a classroom with a teacher. And one of our principles from day one is that we are a tool that teachers deploy in their classrooms and out of class to support their teaching and to support students' learning. And that means that sometimes we have to dial back the level of adaptivity to ensure that they have a classroom that they can keep track of. They have a classroom that they are in control of, and in the most positive sense, that they can guide and shepherd. There are, mechanisms in EP where teachers can differentiate as much as they would like to, and many do use those. And it allows them to move up, I guess, the spectrum to that next level without forcing 100% adaptivity and differentiation on them when they're perhaps not ready for that yet.
Such a good point, because it reminds me of that tug of war you've just talked about between research and practice, and having, the two work really well together. And it made me think you've often talked about how important teacher and student feedback is to the product. And that same tug of war between what teachers and students say they want and what the research is saying. So I wondered if you must have had a lot of moments along the journey where users or teachers and students were saying that they wanted something, and it made you rethink what the evidence says. Were there examples you can share about that?
Yeah, I mean, probably the best example of that was when we shifted from our vocab tool Language Perfect out to Education Perfect. So EP is a set of structured lessons, whereas Language Perfect was very much a targeted vocabulary acquisition tool. And when we came up with the idea of rolling some of the best ideas from Language Perfect out to other subjects, we knew that we had a strong evidence base behind us. We knew that it worked. At least we knew that it worked in languages. And initially, the very first version of EP that we built was very much a quiz tool. It had a lot of these same mechanics of our Language Perfect tool, but we built it out for history and geography and science and English, and we took it out into the classroom and spent quite a bit of time with teachers and students. At that stage, to be, if I'm honest with myself, we thought that we kind of knew it all, and we had this vision for how we were going to transform education with this new tool that we were bringing forward, which was science-based and did work. But when we got into the classrooms, we found that really a history classroom and a geography classroom and a science classroom all have different needs. They're trying to teach different shapes of knowledge, and that actually, vocabulary with its very sort of atomic facts was, if anything, the exception, the outlier, rather than the rule. And so we had to adapt. And I think rather than us saying the evidence was wrong, I think perhaps we misread the evidence. And when you look a little bit more broadly, there is a whole lot of evidence that then supports this transition that we made. Bloom's taxonomy probably is the best example, of saying actually we were catering incredibly well to one of the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but teachers were trying to teach the whole taxonomy, right? And so to support them, to support their classrooms, to support the different shapes of knowledge and skills, and to push students, we needed to build a platform that genuinely was able to map these different shapes. And so EP's lessons ended up looking quite different to what Language Perfect did. We ended up building in very careful scaffolding. We ended up ensuring that anything we were testing students on, we built in information up front so that they were actually able to get to the quiz having engaged with the information before they got there. And we also made a more explicit separation between the learning and the quizzing side of things and our assessments, and then close that loop between that larger outer loop between assessments and the information we can gain from those, and tying those back into which lessons each student needed to be focused on. So we ended up with a series of nested loops within loops with EP. But that was very much based on our teachers and students saying, look, we see what you're building, and it's interesting, but it doesn't solve the problem that we need to have solved in our classroom at the moment. And that forced us to adapt and shift there.
Now, Shane, we've talked a bit about evidence. We've talked about evidence in terms of product design and evidence sort of being gathered to make sure the product's working. And I want to call out a bit of a tension here, because I think it's a fairly important tension to recognise. There can be a credibility question that any EdTech company like EP faces when they claim to be evidence-based, because there's also the commercial reality of the incentive that they have to say that. Schools have been burned by products that dress up engagement metrics as learning outcomes, and we've referred to that a little bit already. How do you think about that tension, and what do you think EP still needs to do to keep earning that trust?
Jazz, I think this is a great question, and it's a great call out. I think when I reflect on this, that there are roughly 3 stages that each EdTech firm goes through when they're grappling with evidence. The first is really, the marketing team cherry picking ideas from the research that sort of vaguely matches up to concepts or mechanisms that you have in your product. obviously this is the least valuable for students because there's not necessarily alignment there. The second one, which we do see quite a bit of, is building in surface level implementations to kind of tick a box. To say, we do Bloom's taxonomy because look, we have mapped it out here, therefore it's done. But I think that there is a third layer, and to some extent, I would hope that all EdTech firms sort of move through these phases and get to this third point. The third layer, which is building an evidence base to demonstrate that not only have you understood the ideas and the literature, but you've crossed the chasm between a great idea and successfully implementing it in a way that moves the dial for students. And this is an area that I think I'm incredibly proud to have seen EP mature in. We have always had evidence as part of our DNA. We probably have gone through these three phases ourselves to some extent. I'd like to think much earlier than other EdTechs out there and have got to this third phase a lot more quickly. But there have definitely been moments in the past where we've sort of looked around and said, "Oh, okay, well our product obviously works. I wonder why." And I think this is an area where our impact team is doing a fantastic job of ensuring that as we go forward, every new feature that we build in has a very strong evidence base behind it. But not only that we're going out and after we build it, validating that the ideas that we know are good ideas actually work in our context and that we've implemented them in a way that actually moves the dial.
Yeah, look, I think credibility and evidence are a perfect segue into this big topic of AI, because we see a lot of players coming to that table trying to quickly spin up evidence to show that their AI tool is working. And I've heard you talk a lot about making sure that it's AI for learning. And in recent years, you've been heavily involved, and I mentioned in the introduction, coming back to be personally involved in the use of AI to power the formative feedback loop, and not just in a small way, but at scale. And it's led us to partner with Professor Rose Luckin and have that impact study on it. So I thought it'd be really interesting to hear from your point of view what you are hoping EP's AI feedback tool can really create value for teachers and students, and what's the problem it's trying to solve eventually.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if I think back, almost 3 years ago now, when we saw these first AI chatbots come out, obviously I'd been in this EdTech space for many years prior to that and had, I guess, an open set of challenges that I didn't yet know how to solve. And these AI tools came through, and there was this light bulb moment that I think went off in many of our heads to say, hey, some of these unsolved challenges might actually be tractable now. One of the ones that really sprang to mind for us was how to use AI to assist students as they engage with open-ended responses and open-ended questioning. So, EP, I see EP as a series of nested feedback loops, as I might have mentioned. And we've always had great feedback mechanisms for simple questions. So whether it's vocab, whether it's multi-choice questions, for simple questions that computers could traditionally tractably gauge how well a student has done from. We were able to feed that into all of our repetition algorithms and the space repetition and achieve a fantastic recall with those. However, as we move from the Language Perfect tool to EP, and as we grappled with how this tool is going to work in a history classroom or an English classroom, we realized that these closed questions were actually really limiting, and that a lesson that focused just on those could never really open up higher order thinking opportunities for students. And so our EP lessons these days have a whole bunch of open-ended textual responses in them. And we did build in feedback mechanisms for these, but they they involved humans. So we built, initially a teacher feedback mechanism where teachers could give their students feedback on their responses. We heard from teachers that this was a huge load on them, and also that they wanted to engage their students more in this process. And so we built in a peer review mechanism, which was a second attempt at trying to get feedback to the students about these styles of responses. We heard them from teachers to say peer review is great, but we can't use it all the time. The overhead's too great for most of our lessons. It's fantastic for the occasional English essay or history essay where, everyone's put a lot of time into the response, and it's a great chance for reflection, but not all the time. And so when AI came through, we saw that there was a fantastic opportunity to really tighten that feedback loop that we had there, the existing feedback loops that we had, and to give students feedback in real time that was 100% personalized to their response and situation. The other thing that we had seen prior to bringing AI into this was that when teachers were swamped, which we know that they are, and when students knew that there was a chance that the work that they submitted may or may not get a review, that there was a significant incentive for the students who wanted to take the path of least resistance to put rubbish in, to not really try. And we really wanted also to solve that motivation piece there, and get all students up to a baseline level, so that actually they'd put in their best efforts and had an opportunity to learn. And so what we implemented was that now when students engage with these open-ended questions in EP, we have an AI tool in the background which analyzes the response. It's given as much context as we can get on the background. This is a year 9 question. It's teaching a certain amount. This is what a great answer looks like. This is what's expected of the students. And off the back of that, it gives a set of targeted feedback to the student within a few seconds. And the student then has an opportunity to reflect on this feedback. And initially when we brought this out, we stopped there. But we realized, well, hey, we've got an opportunity here to also address the motivation perspective of this as well. And so we introduced something called the learning loop. And what the learning loop does is that answers that are either way off base because there's a significant misunderstanding, or where the student hasn't put in the effort really required for this question, the student is given that feedback, but then the system says, actually, we would really like you to give this another go. And there's a loop there where they need to reach a certain level before they can proceed. And what we found is that implementing that loop had a significant impact on the style of responses that students gave, the amount of effort that they put in, and off the back of that, the quality of their responses and the amount of learning that they were able to do in the process.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you, Shane. It really, really good to get sort of the context and the problems that tool is solving, as well as hear about how it's working. And yeah, just to confirm, the early signals from that AI feedback tool have been incredibly encouraging. So students are engaging with the feedback. Teachers are telling us it's very much filling that gap that they couldn't fill themselves all the time in terms of giving the feedback. But we are still also very actively developing that and tracking its performance and measuring its impact on learning. How do you think about that idea of shipping something that's showing real promise while we're still sort of building that evidence and iterating it?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think it's particularly pertinent for AI at the moment because the technology itself is evolving so rapidly that it's really difficult for the evidence to keep up. Just literally, the time that it takes to run the studies, the models have shifted significantly from where they were when you started. I think I've got a few pieces to that answer. I mean, the first is that we had a sound set of principles to suggest that what we were looking at had a very high chance of working. We knew, from the evidence that timely, personalized feedback has a significant impact on students' ability to adapt and respond and to learn. And then the other thing is that we knew that, this was an area of the product that we were quite dissatisfied with the status quo with, and that we knew that there was quite a bit of room to improve the existing situation. So we were starting from what was an acceptable base point before, but actually a baseline point that had lots of room for improvement, and then applying some sensible principles around how we might improve that. The other thing to say is that we spent over 12 months going from our first idea of this through to our official release. And the first, that had a number of parts to it. The first is, very consciously framing how the AI was going to be integrated into the product. There is a temptation. It's very easy to drop a chatbot anywhere and say, right, I have AI in my product now. But chatbots are open-ended, and there is some interesting evidence that suggests that depending on who the student is, if you've got very, very motivated students, they can get value out of a chatbot in isolation. But there's also always a temptation to get the chatbot to do the heavy lifting for you, at which stage you've lost the learning opportunity. And so we're very conscious about how we integrated our AI feedback. It's not a chatbot, and it doesn't do the heavy lifting. It refuses to do the heavy lifting for students, but it does give them guidance around where they can go to next. The second piece was extensive dog fooding. So we used this tool for hundreds of hours ourselves, both in our own learning and simulated learning environments, to see, does this actually feel right? Does this seem to work? We also spent numerous hours, doing interviews with both teachers and students, and then went into classrooms with early versions of this to get direct feedback from both teachers and students about their experience of it up front. And so by the time we launched, we had every reason to believe that this had a very high chance of working. And then upon launch, we immediately started tracking how people engaged with it and collecting a first set of efficacy evidence to validate that what we had built was actually out in the real world and working.
Thank you for sharing that, because it's so interesting reading the research about AI in the feedback loop. I think everyone is excited about the possibilities of what it can do, but we know that there can be a gap between what we're hoping for and what the reality is in practice. That point around the feedback needing to be actionable is a big piece, and that the AI needs to know exactly where, needs to be close to the student to know exactly what comes next, and in concert with teachers. We know what an important role teachers play in that feedback loop. And it made me think about you, James, because you're out there in classrooms with hundreds of teachers all the time, especially through our impact study. So I just wondered if you're seeing firsthand what the feedback loop, is achieving in practice in classrooms.
I'm really confident and comfortable saying that the feedback loop is already doing something really, really meaningful. So students are getting responses to work that in a lot of cases would have gone unmarked, and they're improving their answers. They're having another go. Teachers, they're building trust in it. They can see the feedback. They're increasingly comfortable with the quality. But the big open question is, for us at the moment, sort of causation versus correlation almost, which is we're seeing improvement in the task in the moment, right. But we need to understand whether that's translating to deeper learning over time. That's where this really matters. We're also, and Shane, you referred to this, but also when we spoke to Rose Luckin, we're also really watching for this risk of offloaded thinking, and making sure that AI is sort of prompting students to think harder, and not giving them an easy out. I'm interested though. So Shane, what's your ambition for where this goes next, not just as a feature, but in terms of the evidence that we build around it?
I think really, I think you hit the nail on the head saying that what we'd really like to see here is to track this from implementation all the way through to long-term recall, and prove end to end that having implemented this, students have learnt more and are better off in the process. So far, we've got some fantastic data to indicate that in the moment, they have responded more effectively. And I think that it's going to be fascinating, but also fantastic to follow this through and to see what that does to their long-term recall, and so hopefully demonstrate that actually a more personalized, adaptive set of feedback for them does genuinely move the dial for them. In terms of the feature itself, I think particularly as the technology continues to evolve, I'm really looking forward to being able to make this more and more personalized for each student, and being able to give the AI as much context as possible, so that when it gives feedback, it really is speaking to this individual, and really able to move them through their journey towards a deeper understanding, I guess.
I'm really glad you called out long-term memory, because previous guest, Nidhi Sachdeva, helped us understand that the definition of learning is a stable change in long-term memory. And we know that the interplay between short-term memory and long-term memory, and a role that feedback has in that loop. So, and AI can help in concert with the teacher. And it makes the impact study that I know you're leading, James, so crucial for measuring that. And it makes me think about the future, and how we look forward to where we're going with all of this. We've subtitled this episode, "It's More Urgent Than Ever," and it does really feel like that. With stakes are very high, schools are under a lot of pressure, and it's coming at them from every direction. We've got workload issues for teachers. We've got budget constraints. We obviously have AI disrupting everything, and everyone trying to work out how to make the most of that technology. We've also got this back to basics movement, or rather forward to fundamentals, as we've called it in other conversations. But all of it is really asking for accountability, which is not a bad thing. But it's making me think about the approach that you've described, Shane. Evidence first, close to teachers, iterate honestly. Does it matter more now for you personally than when you started?
I think it's, if I look back to where we started from, and we think back to one of Craig's underlying principles, that underlying principle was all of our students have a limited amount of time in their lives. And so any time that they spend on our platform is precious. And, that applies to school environments too. Teachers and students have limited time in their day. And every time a teacher decides to go to EP for a task to assist their teaching, there's a real opportunity cost for them choosing this rather than another style of teaching, whether it's being up the front or going into small groups, for example. And I think we have a duty of care to ensure that they're spending this precious time in a way that's really going to move the dial for their students. And I think that it has always been true, but it is very true today. It is interesting to reflect on both schools, for both teachers and students, on the value of an hour of their day. And it's also then interesting to reflect on, well, in the scale of things, when we're purchasing software, when we're thinking about what we're going to get our teachers and students to, do we really take into account just how valuable that time is, and do we take into account the opportunity cost of applying a certain technique in a place as opposed to other options at that time?
Nice. It sort of pains me to say, but this is the last question for you, Shane. So if another founder of an EdTech firm came to you tomorrow and said that they genuinely want to put learning first, what would you tell them that they have to get right?
I think if there was one action that they could take that would move them in the best possible direction, it would be to spend as much time as possible with both teachers and students, because teachers have an amazing depth of knowledge themselves around both the evidence, but also what works in practice. They tend to be very willing to share that. I know that we have always been warmly welcomed into classrooms everywhere that we've been, and teachers have been very generous with their ideas and with their time with us. And of everything, I think that puts you on the right pathway. Beyond that, obviously, go out and try and understand what the evidence actually says. Ensure that when you're implementing an idea, that once you've implemented, you actually check that it works. But I think the founding principle is that if you're spending a lot of time with teachers and students, they're probably going to tell you if it's not working, and that's going to set you back on track. So if I had one recommendation, it would be that.
Yep, it's very hard to keep it simple in many ways, and there's many problems that we can solve, and you've certainly solved a lot of them over your time. So thank you for everyone who has used EP, for you and Craig starting this incredible company. Where should listeners go to find out more about the journey and everything we've talked about today?
I think probably the most interesting place for them to go, we've just recently launched an impact page on our website, which walks through a whole lot of the work that we've recently been doing in demonstrating this. So that's www.educationperfect.com/impact. I think that's a fantastic starting point, and it's a fantastic resource for teachers and students, full stop.
We'll put those notes in the show notes. But thank you so much for this conversation today, Shane. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you both, Jill and James. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.